What if I told you that back in the 1930s, some of the absolute smartest people on the planet, the total vanguard of the academic elite, just decided that talking about God was completely meaningless?
Yeah, and not just culturally outdated or, scientifically incorrect, but literally fundamentally gibberish.
Right. Just like random noises coming out of a human face that meant absolutely nothing.
It's really a wild piece of intellectual history. I mean, there was this period where the gates of academia were basically locked from the inside.
Yeah.
And if a concept couldn't be proven with, like, a math equation or a physical experiment, it was just exiled,
Yeah.
completely exiled from serious conversation.
Wow. Well, welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a really massive, sprawling, honestly incredibly dense stack of source material from the Oxford Handbook of Philosophical Theology.
It is dense, yeah. It's basically the definitive academic text on the subject right now.
It really is. And our mission today is to figure out how we got from that total exile in the 1930s to where we are now. Because now, modern philosophers are using the most rigorous, cold, calculating tools of logic to tackle, the most mind-bending questions of religion.
And we're going to cover an immense amount of ground here.
Yeah.
We're looking at how these scholars dissect the origins of the universe, how they map out the really deep paradoxical mysteries of the Christian Trinity, and, how they navigate the philosophical traditions of Judaism and Islam, too.
But the goal isn't just to list historical facts, right?
Yeah.
We want to extract the core arguments, look at the actual mechanics of how these scholars parse ancient texts, and really understand why these highly theoretical debates actually matter to how you, like, as a human being listening to this, view your own existence.
Absolutely.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can explore what modern philosophers are saying about God today, we really have to look at that historical backdrop. You have to understand how theology ever got permission to re-enter the room.
Right. And to understand that exile, you really have to look at the massive divide that defined 20th century philosophy.
The big split.
Yeah, the split between the analytic tradition and the continental tradition. If you imagine the academic world as this giant city, these were two completely different neighborhoods. They spoke different languages, but they both basically put up massive signs saying, theology not welcome.
So let's walk into the analytic neighborhood first, because these were the philosophers who wanted their field to be as clean and precise and, universally agreeable as math or physics.
Right. They leaned incredibly heavily into empiricism. You have figures in the sources like Wilfrid Sellars, who famously declared that science is the measure of all things.
Science is the measure of all things.
Exactly. Sellars and his contemporaries were just totally swept up in the scientific advancements of the early 20th century, quantum mechanics, relativity.
Massive leaps in biology.
All of it, yeah. And they looked at the progress of science and thought, why is philosophy still arguing about the exact same things Plato argued about?
So they wanted a fix.
They did. Their solution was this movement called logical empiricism. So figures like Otto Neurath, Moritz Schlick, and especially Rudolf Carnap, they essentially built a philosophical machine designed to process human language and just throw out anything that wasn't hard data.
Right. They instituted the verification principle. I like to think of them acting like incredibly strict bouncers at an exclusive club.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
So if you walk up to the door with a statement, the bouncer asks, can I verify this statement by observing it with my 5 senses, or like by doing a mathematical proof? So if you say, the boiling point of water is 100 degrees Celsius, the bouncer's like, cool, come on in.
Right, put it in a test tube, verify it, you're in.
But what happens when the theologian walks up to the door?
Well, the theologian walks up and says, God is a transcendent being of pure love. And the logical empiricist bouncer doesn't say, I disagree with you, prove it.
Oh, they don't even ask for proof.
No. The bouncer says, your sentence has no actual content. It literally cannot be verified empirically. Carnap had this famously biting critique where he likened metaphysicians, which, by the way, absolutely includes theologians, to musicians without musical ability.
Ouch. That is academic shade of the highest order.
It was brutal. I mean, Carnap argued that when a theologian talks about the divine, the noises they're producing are entirely devoid of factual content. They're basically trying to express an emotional attitude toward life, which is what art and music do, but they're doing it through the medium of theoretical language.
So it looks like they're stating facts, but they're not.
Exactly. So they fail at science, and because it's dry philosophy, they fail at making it sound beautiful like music. They're just making meaningless noise.
Okay, so the analytic side essentially says talking about God is a failure of grammar and science. But then you walk across town to the continental philosophers, and you'd think, given their focus on existentialism and human experience and, literature, they might be a little more open to the mystical or the unquantifiable. But they shut the door too. Why?
They shut the door, yeah, but the lock was completely different. Thinkers influenced by the German philosopher Martin Heidegger were deeply concerned with this concept of being, with a capital B.
Okay.
So they looked at theology and said, if God is truly the infinite, transcendent creator of the universe, then God is way beyond all human categories.
Like God isn't just another thing in the universe you can put in a box.
God is beyond the very concept of existence as we understand it.
So for the continental side, the problem isn't that God is meaningless. The problem is that human philosophy is just too small.
Precisely. They argued that trying to pin God down with theoretical human philosophy like trying to define God's attributes or logically deduce his nature isn't just a hopeless academic exercise, it's actually a spiritual danger.
Wait, a danger?
Yeah, they thought it was idolatrous. Because if you think you've perfectly defined God in a philosophy textbook, you aren't worshiping God anymore. You're worshiping a human-made concept. You've built this conceptual idol, a simulacrum, rather than submitting to the true, incomprehensible, overwhelming divine.
Okay, so the analytics say talking about God is meaningless nonsense. The continentals say talking about God is arrogant idolatry. The club is totally, completely closed to theology. But the sources show this massive revival happening in the late 20th century, like philosophical theology comes roaring back. So did philosophers just suddenly have a collective spiritual awakening? Or did the bouncers at the club get fired?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it was definitely the bouncers losing their jobs. The entire epistemological foundation of the mid-20th century just collapsed under its own weight.
Wow.
First, logical empiricism died a very public death in the 1960s. Philosophers finally realized that the verification principle itself, that strict rule that every meaningful statement must be empirically verifiable, could not itself be empirically verified.
Wait, let me make sure I have that. You're saying you can't put the rule, everything must be testable in a lab, into a lab to test it.
Exactly. The central dogma of logical empiricism was, by its own definition, meaningless gibberish.
That is hilarious.
It was a completely self-defeating philosophy. And as that realization dawned on everyone, the analytic tradition lost its absolute obsession with policing the strict limits of human thought. But the truly crucial development, the real nail in the coffin, was the collapse of what epistemologists call classical foundationalism.
Okay, break that down for us. What exactly is classical foundationalism?
So classical foundationalism is this deeply ingrained theory of how human beings know things. If you've ever taken a philosophy class and read René Descartes, the I think, therefore I am guy, you've seen this in action.
Right.
The theory demands that our minds are like buildings. For any belief to be justified, it has to rest on a completely indestructible foundation. And to be in that foundation, a belief must be indubitable.
Indubitable meaning like absolutely impossible to doubt, right? Like I cannot doubt that 2 + 2 = 4.
Right. It had to be mathematically self-evident or immediately evident to your direct senses, like, I feel pain right now. And if a belief wasn't in that tiny foundational bedrock, it had to be perfectly logically deduced from it. If it didn't meet those criteria, you basically had no rational right to believe it.
But wait, if those are the rules, that doesn't just kick religion out of the building. That kicks almost everything out. I mean, I can't mathematically prove that the sun will rise tomorrow. I just assume it will based on past experience.
Exactly.
I can't definitively prove that you have a conscious mind and aren't just some highly advanced biological robot mimicking conversation. I can't even prove my memories of yesterday aren't false memories implanted 5 minutes ago.
And that is exactly what philosophers realized. Almost nothing we believe, including the basic assumptions required to actually do physical science, meets the impossibly high standard of classical foundationalism.
That's wild.
So when philosophers finally admitted that classical foundationalism was broken, the door flew wide open. Suddenly, alternative theories of knowledge emerged. It became intellectually permissible to argue that a belief could be perfectly rational and justified, even if it wasn't mathematically provable or testable in a lab.
Okay, so the bouncers are gone. The door is open. Philosophy is allowed to talk about God again without being laughed out of the room. But that immediately raises a massive logistical question, doesn't it? If we are allowed to talk about God, how does God talk to us? Like, how does an infinite being actually communicate with a finite listener?
Right, the mechanics of it.
Yeah. And this brings us to the philosophy of revelation in Scripture, drawing on thinkers like Richard Swinburne and Stephen T. Davis.
This is where the philosophical rubber really meets the road. Before we ask how God speaks, we have to establish the fundamental purpose of revelation. Like, why would a divine being bother to communicate with humanity at all?
Good question.
According to traditional theology, it's not just to drop a cosmic encyclopedia on our heads to satisfy our intellectual curiosity. The purpose is profoundly relational. It's to bridge three immense gaps that exist between God and humanity.
Okay, what's the first gap?
The ontological gap. Ontology is the study of being. There is an infinite difference in the kind of existence God has versus the kind we have. God is eternal, self-existent, all-powerful. We are fragile, temporary, dependent creatures made of carbon.
So the sheer difference in scale makes natural communication impossible.
Exactly.
Okay, the second gap.
The epistemological gap. This is the difference in knowledge. God is completely omniscient, meaning he knows all truths, all pasts, all futures, and we are stumbling around in the dark, bound by time, with incredibly limited understanding.
And the third gap, which the sources highlight as the most crucial for religious practice, is the moral gap.
Yes. The gap between absolute perfect divine holiness and human selfishness, depravity, and brokenness. Traditional theology argues that God desires a loving, personal relationship with humanity, but you cannot have a loving relationship across those three gaps unless the greater party initiates it. God has to reveal things that we could never, ever figure out on our own.
Now, this interventionist view of God reaching down is a sharp contrast to a very popular Enlightenment idea called deism, right? The whole clockmaker God concept.
Exactly. Deism proposes a God who creates the universe, winds up the laws of physics like a giant grandfather clock, and then steps back, never interfering again. In a deist universe, there's only natural revelation.
Meaning I can look at a sunset or study the complexity of an eye or look at the math of gravity and deduce, wow, there must be a smart creator. But that creator never actually sends me a text message.
Right. But traditional Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are fundamentally interventionist. They believe in special revelation. This is God actually stepping onto the stage of history. You know, burning bushes, prophetic dreams, the parting of the Red Sea, the incarnation, and of course the text of Scripture itself.
Right.
But within this idea of special revelation, there's a fierce debate among philosophers that I think is utterly fascinating. It's the question, does God reveal propositions or does God only reveal events?
Okay, explain the difference here because the sources do spend a lot of time on this. What is a proposition in this specific context?
A proposition is a statement that expresses a truth claim. It's words, sentences, like God loves humanity or thou shalt not steal. In the 20th century, there was this massive trend among theologians who were really uncomfortable with the idea of a dictating God. They argued that God doesn't give us static, cold sentences.
So what does he give us?
Instead, they said God only reveals himself through dynamic personal encounters or historical events. Humans experience the event, and then humans, using their own flawed language, make up the propositions to try and describe the event.
Oh, I see. But the scholars in our Oxford text push back against that idea really hard. They defend propositional revelation. Why is it so necessary that God actually gives us the words?
Because bare events do not interpret themselves. Think about it. Let's say you're an ancient Israelite standing on the shores of the Red Sea. Suddenly, a massive wind blows and the water parts, leaving dry land. That is a staggering, mind-blowing historical event. But without a proposition attached to it, what does it actually mean?
I mean, it could just be a freak meteorological anomaly. Or I could think, wow, the God of the ocean is really angry at the water today.
Exactly. Without God propositionally communicating, I am the God of your ancestors and I am parting this water to deliver you into a covenant relationship, the event has no theological content whatsoever.
That makes total sense.
Yeah, if a religion claims there is actual truth involved in a revelatory act, that truth must be expressible in propositions. Furthermore, if the whole point of revelation is relationship, how do you have a relationship without shared truth claims? You can't have a relationship with God without accepting propositions like God is forgiving or God desires justice.
So the events are the lightning, but the propositions are the thunder that actually tells you what just happened.
That's a great analogy.
But if we accept that God communicates truth through texts, like through the Bible, we immediately run into a massive practical roadblock because the text is incredibly messy. It's full of things that seem completely contradictory to modern ears.
Oh, absolutely. This is the realm of hermeneutics, which is the philosophy of interpretation.
Hmm.
And one of the biggest misconceptions modern people have is that the early church was just a bunch of simpletons who took every single word of the Bible as flat, literal history.
Which they didn't.
Right. Long before modern science or the Enlightenment, ancient scholars knew that if you read the Bible strictly literally, the system breaks down.
Yeah, the sources highlight this beautifully. On the one hand, you have the scientific contradictions, like Book of Genesis describes a cosmos with a solid dome over the earth, holding back waters in the sky. But ancient Greek science had already calculated the earth was a sphere.
Right. They knew better.
But even more pressingly for the early Christians, there were the profound moral contradictions.
This was the major crisis of the second century. You have Jesus in the New Testament preaching radical nonviolence, telling people to turn the other cheek and love their enemies. But in the Old Testament, in books like Joshua and Judges, you have God seemingly commanding the total military extermination of the Canaanites, men, women, and children.
How do they reconcile a God of infinite love ordering what looks to us like a total war crime?
The tension was so severe that it led to the Marcionite controversy. Marcion was this very prominent Christian leader in Rome in the second century. He was so horrified by the violence and apparent wrath of the Old Testament God that he proposed a radical solution. He essentially said, "This cannot possibly be the same God." Yeah, he argued that the Old Testament God was a lesser, angry deity, and the Father of Jesus was a completely different, higher God of pure love.
Which is a huge theological heresy for a monotheistic religion.
It was. Marcion actually created his own Bible. He entirely scrapped the Old Testament, and he took a pair of scissors to the New Testament, cutting out anything that looked too Jewish or connected Jesus to the Old Testament creator.
Wow.
The Orthodox Church ultimately rejected Marcion and excommunicated him. They insisted that the Old Testament and the New Testament described the exact same God. But to defend that, they needed a system. They needed a philosophical master key for how to read a messy text. And this is where giant figures like St. Augustine and Origen come in.
Augustine's rule for interpretation is absolutely brilliant. I really want to make sure you listening get this because it totally changes how you view ancient religion. Augustine stated that if a passage of Scripture, when taken in its most natural, literal sense, does not lead to purity of life or does not lead to sound, established doctrine, it must be read metaphorically.
Think about the weight of that. They weren't using modern historical critical methods. They weren't digging up Babylonian tablets to find out what the original human author meant in 1000 BC. They were asking a theological question. What does the ultimate author God mean for us today?
Right.
If a literal reading of a text makes God look evil, or if it contradicts the core doctrine of love, or if it contradicts definitively known science, the literal reading is wrong. You are forced to look for the deeper metaphor.
And the quintessential example provided in the sources is Psalm 137, verse 9. For context, this is a psalm written during the Babylonian captivity. The Israelites have watched their city burn, they've been dragged into exile, and the psalm is this tragic lament. But it ends with this horrific, shocking blessing. It essentially says, "Happy is the one who takes your little ones, your babies, O Babylon, and dashes them against the rocks."
Yeah, a literal reading of that text is basically a celebration of infanticide. It's profoundly immoral and completely contradicts the teachings of Jesus. So the early church fathers, employing Augustine and Origen's hermeneutical rule, refused to read it literally. They interpreted it as a complex spiritual metaphor.
Walk us through how they decoded it.
Well, in their metaphorical reading, Babylon symbolically represents the kingdom of evil or the chaos of sin. The little ones, or the offspring of Babylon, do not represent human children. They represent our own nascent, early evil inclinations.
Like the tiny seeds of pride or lust or greed that are just starting to grow in our minds.
Exactly. And the rock. Drawing on other scriptures, the rock represents Christ.
So when you put the metaphor together, the passage becomes, happy is the person who takes their earliest, tiniest evil impulses and destroys them against the solid strength of Christ. It completely flips the text from a horrific war crime into a manual for psychological and spiritual purity.
It's an elegant, deeply philosophical way of preserving the authority of the text while demanding that the text serve the ultimate moral good. But of course, this entire process of interpretation relies heavily on the underlying assumption that the text is, in fact, inspired.
The God is somehow uniquely behind these words.
Right, and the Philosophical Handbook dives deep into the different models of what biblical inspiration actually looks like mechanically. Like, how did God get his ideas into the heads of the writers?
Well, if you ask a random person on the street how inspiration works, they probably imagine the dictation model. God is sitting in a big chair in heaven, dictating words, and the Apostle Paul is sitting at a desk like a stenographer, just copying down verbatim what he hears.
Which very few serious philosophical theologians hold today, mostly because it completely fails to account for the obvious human evidence in the text. I mean, Paul doesn't sound anything like David. The Gospel of Mark is written in rough, street-level Greek, while the Gospel of Luke is written in highly polished, physician-level literary Greek.
Right, if God is dictating it all, why does God keep changing his vocabulary and grammar based on who's holding the pen?
Exactly. So if it's not dictation, how do philosophers explain it? One of the most intricate models comes from philosopher William Lane Craig, who utilizes a concept called middle knowledge, or Molinism.
Okay, this requires a bit of a mental leap.
It does. Middle knowledge posits that God, in his infinite omniscience, doesn't just know everything that will happen. He also perfectly knows everything that would happen under any possible set of circumstances. He knows what any free creature would freely choose to do in any hypothetical situation.
Okay, wait, let's pause and debate this, because this always gives me a philosophical headache. If my choice is truly free, then there is no fact about what I'm going to do until I actually make the decision. If you offer me a sandwich tomorrow, there's no pre-existing fact about whether I'll take it. So how can God know a fact that doesn't even exist yet?
That is the primary objection to Molinism. How can there be truth values to counterfactuals of creaturely freedom? But Craig and other Molinists argue that because God's knowledge is infinite and eternal, he eternally knows the essence of your free will.
Interesting.
So apply this to biblical inspiration. God wants the book of Romans written, and he wants it to contain very specific theological propositions. But he doesn't want to violate the Apostle Paul's free will. Because God has middle knowledge, he knows exactly what a man with Paul's specific background, vocabulary, and personality would freely choose to write if he were placed in the exact historical circumstances of being a missionary in the first century, dealing with a specific crisis in the Roman Church.
Whoa. So God basically orchestrates all of human history, playing absolute 4D chess to ensure that Paul is born, gets his education, has his conversion experience, and finds himself in a room with a pen, so that Paul, acting with 100% free will, spontaneously decides to write the exact sentences God eternally wanted written.
Precisely. It preserves human freedom entirely, explains the human vocabulary and style, but guarantees the divine message. But that's just one model. You also have social inspiration, which suggests God didn't just inspire the individual writers, but inspired the entire community of editors and scribes who shaped the text over centuries.
Makes sense.
And then you have a very modern approach, Kern Robert Trembath's reader-oriented view.
I found Trembath's view really interesting, but honestly, also a bit troubling. Explain how he views the Bible.
Trembath argues that we've been looking at inspiration all wrong. We've been looking at the ancient text and trying to figure out what magical property God injected into the ink. Trembath says inspiration isn't a property of the historical origins of the text, it's a property of the reader's experience in the present day.
Okay.
So the Bible is inspired solely because it successfully mediates the experience of salvation to the Christian community today. It basically functions as a conduit for a spiritual encounter.
And here is where I really have to push back on Trembath. Because if a book is only inspired because it moves me, or because it facilitates an encounter with the divine for the reader, how is the Bible ontologically any different from any other great piece of literature?
That's the question.
Right, if I read Homer's Iliad and it gives me a profound realization about human mortality, is the Iliad inspired? If I read a really effective self-help book and it completely changes my life, is that scripture? If the magic is only happening subjectively in my reading experience, doesn't the Bible lose its unique, objective divine authority?
Your critique is exactly why many philosophical theologians find Trembath's view totally insufficient. If inspiration is purely subjective, the Bible is just functionally useful, not intrinsically authoritative. It becomes a tool rather than a truth.
So how do we fix that?
To rescue the authority of the text while acknowledging its human origins, philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff proposes the concept of appropriated discourse.
How does that work?
Think about the corporate world. Imagine a CEO wants to send out a company-wide memo. The CEO calls in an executive assistant and says, "Draft a letter explaining our new vacation policy. Make it sound encouraging." The assistant goes to their desk, uses their own vocabulary, their own phrasing, and their own grammatical style to write the memo. At that stage, it is entirely the assistant's discourse.
Right, they wrote it.
But then the assistant brings it back to the CEO. The CEO reads it, approves it, and signs their name at the bottom. The moment the CEO signs it, it officially becomes the CEO's word.
The CEO has appropriated the human discourse.
Exactly. Wolterstorff argues that the human authors of Scripture wrote using their own styles, cultural assumptions, and limited viewpoints. But God, superintending the whole historical process, essentially signs the completed human discourse, appropriating it as his own official divine revelation. It's fully human in its origin, but fully divine in its authorization.
That is a phenomenal analogy. And it transitions us perfectly into our next major topic. Because if we establish that God communicates truth through this incredibly complex, layered, messy, evolutionary human process, we have to ask, does he also create the physical universe the same way? Let's transition from the messy texts to the messy cosmos and dive into Robin Collins' analysis of evolution and divine action.
This is where philosophical theology has to confront modern science head-on. The scientific consensus is clear. The universe is billions of years old, and life evolved through a painfully slow, incredibly brutal, chance-driven process full of mass extinctions, predation, and suffering.
Yeah, nature is metal.
It is. So if you're a philosophical theologian, you have to answer a glaring question. Why would an all-powerful, perfectly loving God choose to create that way? If God is omnipotent, why not just snap his fingers and create a fully formed, perfect paradise instantly? Why use a process that guarantees billions of years of animal suffering before humans even show up?
It is the ultimate question of theodicy, the problem of evil applied to biology. The sources point out that the most common answer among modern theologians, folks like John Polkinghorne and John Hott, is the autonomy of creation defense.
Yes. They argue that a universe that is allowed to make itself through the evolutionary process is intrinsically better, more beautiful, and more valuable than a universe that is strictly determined by a cosmic tyrant. It's basically an extension of the human free will defense, but applied to the natural world.
So God steps back out of love and gives the cosmos the freedom to become whatever it wants to become. The suffering is just the unavoidable byproduct of a free, autonomous nature.
Right. It sounds very poetic. It paints a picture of a very gentle, non-coercive God.
But the sources, specifically Robin Collins, poke some massive logical holes in this, don't they?
They really do. The logical flaw in the autonomy of creation defense is that it anthropomorphizes nature. It projects human psychology onto mindless matter. A radioactive atom does not have a will. It doesn't choose to decay. It just strictly follows quantum probabilities. A tectonic plate doesn't choose to cause an earthquake. To call the physical universe autonomous or free in any morally meaningful sense is a category error. You're pretending rocks and bacteria have the same kind of moral weight as a human being making a choice.
Okay, so if the autonomous universe doesn't work logically, what about the divine hiddenness argument? This is the idea that God used a slow, messy evolutionary process. Specifically so, his fingerprints wouldn't be too obvious. If the universe was instantly created 6,000 years ago with a giant, undeniable, made-by-God stamp on it, human beings would be psychologically coerced into believing we'd have no free will to reject God. So evolution is God's way of giving us plausible deniability.
It's an intriguing idea, but as the host, I know you can spot the historical problem with that argument.
Yeah, the timeline doesn't make any sense at all. Darwin didn't publish On the Origin of Species until 1859. For thousands and thousands of years before that, almost every human being on Earth looked at the complexity of nature, looked at the stars, and absolutely did see a giant made-by-God stamp. The evidence of a creator seemed undeniable to the ancients.
That's right.
And yet, did that undeniable evidence rob them of their free will? No. They still sinned. They still rejected God. They still worshipped idols. So the idea that God needs evolution to hide himself so we can have free will just doesn't hold up historically.
Which brings us to Robin Collins' own highly original proposal. Collins looks at the problem and suggests that God used an evolutionary process because a slow historical emergence allows for deep, intrinsic interconnections between humanity and the rest of creation connections that simply could not exist in a universe that was instantly created ex nihilo, out of nothing.
He outlines 3 specific types of interconnections. The first one is the emergent interconnection. Talk about what that means for human consciousness.
Well, if God creates humans instantly from nothing, our consciousness, our soul, is essentially an alien entity dropped into a physical world. But through evolution, the physical matter of the universe, the carbon, the stardust, complexifies over billions of years until consciousness literally emerges from it.
Oh, wow.
We aren't aliens on a stage. We are the stage itself finally waking up and becoming aware. Our minds are deeply physically rooted in the fundamental structure of the cosmos.
The second is the ancestral interconnection. This is the biological reality that because of evolution, we share a literal family tree with every other living thing on Earth. We're biologically related to the oak tree, the dolphin, the bacteria. We are part of a massive single family of life.
And the third interconnection is where Collins brings in the heavy theological artillery, the redemptive interconnection. He draws on Christian eschatology, specifically the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 8. Paul writes this incredibly profound, mystical passage where he says that all of creation is groaning as if in the pains of childbirth, waiting for the children of God to be revealed, so that creation itself can be liberated from its bondage to decay.
What does that mean in an evolutionary context?
It means that humans are not just trying to escape the physical world to go to a spiritual heaven. It means humans are the actual vehicle through which God plans to redeem the physical cosmos. God's grace flows into humanity, and humanity, because of our emergent and ancestral connections to the physical world, acts as a conduit to heal and elevate the rest of nature.
The source makes a connection here that absolutely blew my mind. It connects this theological idea to Karl Marx's economic concept of the alienation of labor. Let's take a minute to unpack this because it is so profound.
Go for it.
Marx argued that when a human being builds something with their own hands, say a carpenter crafting a beautiful table from a raw tree, they pour their sweat, their creativity, and their soul into that object. The table becomes an objectified extension of their very identity.
But Marx argued that modern capitalism destroys this connection. A factory worker just pulling a lever all day is alienated from the product. The product doesn't represent them. It belongs to the billionaire owner.
Exactly. Now apply that to the cosmos. If God instantly creates a perfect paradise and just hands it to humanity, we are alienated from it. We're just guests in a hotel we didn't build. But Collins is arguing that by participating in the evolutionary struggle and by co-creating and redeeming the world with God over time, humanity pours its own labor, suffering, and love into the cosmos.
The physical universe becomes an extension of our own identity.
Yes, it's the profound difference between a billionaire handing you the keys to a mansion versus you spending 20 years building a house with your own hands, alongside your father, overcoming storms and setbacks together. The love and intrinsic value of the self-built home are infinitely deeper.
That shared struggle is the cornerstone of what Collins calls the connection-building theodicy, or CBT. A theodicy is basically a philosophical defense of God's goodness in the face of evil. Collins hypothesizes that the infinite value of these positive, conscious connections, the deep appreciation that only comes from overcoming suffering together, the beauty of forgiving and being forgiven, the profound bond of shared redemption, actually mathematically and morally outweighs the finite evils, the pain, and the animal suffering that God permitted during the evolutionary process.
So the richness of the final redeemed universe is exponentially greater precisely because of the shared history of suffering and overcoming.
Yes, it's a beautiful, upward-looking view of suffering. But we have to balance the scales here, because the sources also mention philosopher Peter van Inwagen, who takes a much darker, much more pragmatic view of why the world is so full of pain and natural disasters.
Yeah, van Inwagen looks at the sheer hideousness of the world disease, tsunamis, cruelty, and asks what its function is. He argues that humanity, in its current state, is fundamentally separated from God by our own rebellion. If God allowed us to live in a comfortable, painless, utopian paradise while we were in a state of spiritual rebellion, we would never realize how broken we actually are. We would delude ourselves into thinking we were self-sufficient gods.
So the pain is a feature, not a bug.
In a fallen world, yes. Van Inwagen argues that God allows the natural, horrific consequences of our separation from him to play out in the physical world so that we cannot ignore reality. The chaos and the suffering are a massive, undeniable wake-up call to our own total inability to govern ourselves or the planet without divine help. The hideousness of the world shatters our illusion of self-sufficiency.
So you have Collins arguing that suffering builds deep, redemptive connections, and Van Inwagen arguing that suffering shatters our arrogant delusions. Both views, however, point toward a God who is operating on a level of complexity and mystery that completely dwarfs human understanding.
Right.
And that concept of mystery provides a perfect organic bridge. We've talked about how God speaks and how God creates. But who or what exactly is the nature of this God we're dealing with? Let's dive into the deep mysteries of the divine nature, drawing on scholars like William J. Wainwright and Jeffrey E. Brower.
To do this, we have to start by defining what we actually mean by the word mystery in a philosophical context.
Hmm.
Because in everyday language, a mystery is just a puzzle you haven't solved yet. Like, it's a murder mystery. Once you find the clue, the mystery is gone. But in theology, it's very different. And not everyone thinks theological mystery is a good thing.
Right. The sources contrast a couple of historical views here. You have John Toland, a 17th century Enlightenment deist. Toland basically argued that mystery is just a cover-up for bad logic.
Typical Enlightenment.
Totally. He believed that if God is perfectly rational and God gave humans reason, then true religion should be entirely transparent. To Toland, when a priest says it's a mystery, what he's really saying is, my theology has a massive logical contradiction in it, and I want you to stop asking questions.
It's the ultimate skeptical view. But then you swing to the opposite extreme, to the ancient Christian mystic known as Pseudo-Dionysius. He belongs to the tradition of apophatic or negative theology. This is the idea that God so vastly transcends human concepts that all our language completely breaks down when trying to describe him.
Pseudo-Dionysius has this incredibly famous poetic description. He describes the mysteries of God not as darkness, but as the dazzling obscurity of the secret silence, outshining all brilliance with the intensity of their darkness.
I love that phrase so much. Dazzling obscurity. Think about looking directly into the sun. If you stare at the sun, you go blind. But you don't go blind because there's an absence of light. You go blind because there is too much light for your finite optic nerve to process. Pseudo-Dionysius is saying God is like that to the human mind. We can't comprehend him not because he's illogical, but because his truth is too massive for our mental hardware to process.
It is a profound metaphor. But to give it some philosophical rigor, we turn to the great American philosopher and theologian, Jonathan Edwards. Edwards provided an analogy for mystery that I think is one of the most helpful tools in all of philosophical theology. He used the analogy of the microscope.
Walk us through the microscope analogy. Imagine you are holding a leaf.
Okay, so you hold a leaf in your hand and look at it with your naked eye. You understand it generally. It's green, it has veins, it does photosynthesis. You have a boundary of knowledge and a boundary of ignorance. Now, you take that leaf and put it under a powerful microscope. Suddenly, a whole new world opens up. You see cellular walls, chloroplasts, stomata. Your knowledge has definitively increased. You know more true facts about the leaf than you did a minute ago. But for every single new detail you discover, 10 new questions arise. How does the specific protein fold within the chloroplast? What quantum mechanics drive the photon absorption? As your sphere of knowledge grows, the surface area of that sphere, which represents your contact with the unknown, grows exponentially larger. The boundary of your ignorance actually expands the more you learn.
That is brilliant. Edwards is arguing that theology works exactly the same way. We aren't just wallowing in total ignorance. We do learn true things about God through Scripture and philosophy. Our knowledge progresses. But every time we answer one theological question, we suddenly have the vocabulary to ask a dozen deeper, more complex questions we didn't even know existed.
And Edwards took this to its ultimate logical extreme. He argued that even in heaven, when believers are supposedly experiencing the beatific vision, seeing God face to face, the mystery will not end. Because human beings will always be finite and God will always be infinite, an infinite being will always provide an infinite frontier of discovery. Heaven, for Edwards, isn't a static state of knowing everything. It's an eternal journey of discovering more, where the mystery gets endlessly deeper and more beautiful forever.
Which leads to a really wild speculation that I absolutely loved in the sources, from thinkers like Karl Rahner and Rudolf Otto. We usually think of mystery as a human limitation. But if God's nature is truly infinite, can God be a mystery to himself? Like, can the creator of the universe feel awe or astonishment at his own being?
It sounds like a total paradox because Orthodox theology states that God is omniscient. He perfectly knows himself. He has no lack of information. But Otto and Rahner suggest that having perfect information doesn't preclude the experience of awe. Think about the doctrine of the Trinity. You have three infinite persons perfectly knowing and perfectly loving one another. Otto suggests that as the Father contemplates the infinite beauty of the Son, and the Son contemplates the Father, they experience profound, eternal, dynamic wonder at the sheer, inexhaustible majesty of their own shared nature. The infinite constantly dazzling the infinite.
It's a stunning concept. But let's bring it back from the mystical heights down to the hard, rigorous logic that the analytic philosophers demand. One of the oldest, most difficult, and frankly most debated attributes of God's nature is the doctrine of divine simplicity.
Divine simplicity is a bedrock doctrine for thinkers like Thomas Aquinas. It states that God has no parts whatsoever. We obviously mean he has no physical parts, no arms or legs, but it goes deeper. God has no metaphysical parts. He's not composed of different attributes glued together.
Right, so my personality is a composite. I have a little bit of humor, a little bit of anxiety, some knowledge, some ignorance. I am made of parts.
But God is perfectly simple. His existence is utterly identical to his essence. This means God doesn't have love. God is love. God doesn't have power. God is power. His love and his power are just two human words trying to describe the exact same single, undivided reality of his being.
Which sounds very elegant and unified on paper. But as the handbook points out, if you follow the logic of divine simplicity to its conclusion, it creates a massive logical headache regarding God's free will. Let's debate this, because this is where the system seems to break down.
Okay, present the problem.
So what does this all mean for the listener? I mean, if God is perfectly simple and God has no parts and God never changes, how can he make a free contingent choice? Let's take the creation of the universe. God freely chose to create the universe. But if he is truly free, he could have chosen not to create it, right?
Right. Creation is a contingent act, not a necessary one.
But under divine simplicity, God's act of will, his choice, is identical to his essence. So if his choice is his essence, and he had made a different choice, like choosing not to create, then his essence would be different, which means he wouldn't be the same God. It seems like divine simplicity mathematically forces God into being an unthinking, unchoosing, frozen block of necessity. He had to create the world because he couldn't have a different essence.
You have just articulated one of the most forceful historic objections to classical theism. If God's internal acts of will are identical to his unchanging essence, how can the external results be contingent? To solve this, philosopher Jeffrey Brower unpacks a fascinating concept in the text called the revised agent-causal model of volition. And we need to go step by step to understand how this rescues God's freedom.
Break it down for us. What is the normal way we think about making a choice?
Usually we think of a choice as an internal mental state that precedes an action. Let's say I want to raise my hand. First, in my brain, I have the thought or the desire to raise my hand. That is an internal change of state. Then, that internal state causes the physical effect of my hand going up. If God's mind works that way, if he changes his internal state to make a choice, then divine simplicity is destroyed.
Okay, so how does the agent-causal model fix this?
The agent-causal model argues that for a truly supreme free agent, a volition, a choice, is not an internal state that precedes the action. The volition is the pure act of causing the effect.
Wait, say that again. The choice isn't the thought before the action. The choice is the causing itself.
Exactly. God's essence remains a completely simple, unchanging, eternal, pure act of causing, the pure power of agency. Now imagine two possible worlds. In world A, that singular, unchanging act of causing terminates in the creation of a physical universe. In world B, that exact same pure act of causing terminates in nothing being created. The contingent difference, the choice, does not lie within God's simple internal nature. The difference lies entirely in the extrinsic effects that God's agency brings about on the outside.
Oh, okay, I need an analogy for this. Think about a laser pointer. Imagine a perfectly stable, unchanging, continuous laser beam. The beam itself is always exactly the same and never alters its internal state. But if put a mirror in front of it, the laser hits the mirror and lights up the entire room. If I take the mirror away, the laser just shoots off endlessly into the dark space. The massive difference in the outcome, lighting up a room versus shooting into the dark, isn't because the laser changed its internal state. The difference is entirely in what the unchanging laser terminates on externally.
That is an excellent workable analogy for Brower's point. God is the unchanging laser. His essence is simple. But the contingent reality of the universe depends on how that pure act of causing terminates externally. It preserves his simplicity while allowing for a contingent universe.
But this laser beam of God's pure causal power immediately crashes into the next massive debate. Divine providence versus human free will. If God is this ultimate, simple, omniscient, all-powerful cause sustaining every atom in the universe, how can human beings possibly have actual, meaningful free will? Or are we just tuppets on his laser beam?
This is perhaps the most intensely debated topic in all of philosophical theology. The sources outline three main Christian responses to this tension. The first response is to simply cut the Gordian knot and abandon libertarian free will entirely. This is the traditional Calvinist or strict Thomistic route.
Define libertarian free will real quick.
Libertarian free will is the everyday sense of freedom. The idea that in any given situation, you genuinely have the power to choose A or B, and nothing outside of you strictly determines your choice. The Calvinist route argues that God's sovereignty is so absolute that he writes the entire script of history down to the atomic level. Our freedom is simply the fact that we willingly choose to do what we do, acting according to our desires without realizing our desires were ultimately authored by the scriptwriter. We feel free, but we are completely determined by God's providence.
Which is logically neat, but it makes a lot of people deeply uncomfortable because it essentially makes God the author of evil choices. So what is the second option?
The second option is Molinism, which we touched on earlier regarding biblical inspiration. This relies on middle knowledge. God perfectly knows what any free creature would freely do in any hypothetical situation. So God looks at all the infinite possible universes he could create. He finds the one universe where human beings, acting with absolute libertarian free will, freely make the exact choices that ultimately lead to God's perfect sovereign plan. Then he actualizes that specific universe.
So it's like a grandmaster chess player who knows exactly how his opponent will react to every possible move, so he arranges the board to guarantee a checkmate even though the opponent is moving their own pieces freely.
Yes. It tries to perfectly balance absolute sovereignty with true human freedom. But as we discussed, critics argue that middle knowledge is logically impossible because there are no facts about what a truly free creature would do in a hypothetical scenario. This brings us to the third and currently most controversial option, open theism.
Open theism is a radical departure from classical theology. Explain what it proposes about the future.
Open theism argues that the future does not actually exist yet. It is not a settled reality. And because God is omniscient, he perfectly knows reality exactly as it is. Therefore, God knows the past perfectly, he knows the present perfectly, and he knows all possibilities for the future perfectly. But he does not possess absolute foreknowledge of exactly which free choices humans will make.
Wait, so you were saying God takes actual risks?
Yes. Open theists argue that to have a genuine, loving relationship with humanity, God genuinely collaborates with us. When God asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, God doesn't secretly know the outcome beforehand. God is genuinely testing Abraham to see what he will do in real time. God is the ultimate improviser, perfectly capable of achieving his final goals, but constantly adapting his plans to the free, unpredictable choices of humanity.
It makes God seem much more relational, much more emotionally invested in the moment, but it sacrifices the absolute certainty of classical foreknowledge. The theological trade-offs are massive, and this is what I love about this deep dive. The philosophers aren't just shrugging and saying, well, it's a mystery. They are building incredibly rigorous, competitive logical models to map out exactly where the human mind hits the wall of the divine.
And nowhere is that logical scaffolding more severely tested than when we move from the abstract attributes of God into the specific, historically rooted core doctrines of Christianity. These are doctrines that look, on their face, like sheer mathematical paradoxes. We're talking about the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the Eucharist.
Let's start with the big one, the Trinity. The doctrine states there's exactly one God, but this one God exists eternally as three distinct persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. On paper, it looks like a math error. 1 + 1 + 1 = 1. How do analytic philosophers even begin to model this without falling into heresy?
As Michael Rea points out in his chapter, the first step is identifying what you can't do. You can't solve the math problem by cheating. For example, you can't use subordinationism.
Meaning you can't say the Father is the big, infinite, uppercase G God, and Jesus and the Spirit are slightly lesser, lowercase g junior gods?
Exactly. That destroys monotheism. It turns Christianity into polytheism, so that's out. The other massive cheat you can't use is modalism.
Oh, this is the classic analogy everyone uses in Sunday school without realizing it's a heresy. The Superman Clark Kent analogy. God is like water. Sometimes he is ice, sometimes liquid, sometimes steam. Or there's only one person, but he wears 3 different masks depending on the situation.
Right. Modalism says there are no real eternal distinctions in God. It's just one actor playing 3 roles. But as Ray points out, the biblical text destroys this. You have the Son praying to the Father in the Garden of Gethsemane. If modalism is true, that's just God talking to himself in a mirror. Clark Kent doesn't pray to Superman. There must be real, distinct persons who can interact with one another.
So if it's not 3 separate gods, and it's not one guy in 3 masks, what is the philosophical model?
One of the most compelling modern attempts is Brian Leftow's event-based model. He asks us to rethink how we categorize things. Think about the last time you went to a wedding reception. Imagine a woman there named Jane. Over the course of the evening, Jane participates in 3 entirely distinct ongoing events. She is leading a waltz on the dance floor. We'll call that Event L. Later, she is mingling with guests at the table's Event M. And later, she is resting by the wall, catching her breath, event R.
Okay, 3 distinct events, L, M, and R.
Now, event M dancing is not mingling. They have different properties, but what is the physical substance that entirely makes up event L? It's Jane. What is the physical substance that makes up event M? It's Jane. The events are distinct, but they are entirely 100% constituted by the exact same single substance.
So apply that to the infinite nature of God.
Lefto suggests that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are like 3 eternal infinite life events, or streams of divine life. The Father event is distinct from the Son event, but the Father event is entirely constituted by the one undivided infinite divine substance, and the Son event is entirely constituted by that exact same substance. You have 3 distinct relational events occurring simultaneously, all completely made of the singular Jane, the one divine essence.
It's dizzying, but it actually holds together logically. And if you think the Trinity is complicated, Richard Cross's chapter deals with the incarnation. How does the infinite second person of the Trinity, the Son, become a human being? The paradox here is intense. God is omniscient, he knows everything, and God is omnipotent. A human being is ignorant of many things and has limited power. How can one single person be both omniscient and ignorant at the exact same time? It violates the law of non-contradiction.
To solve this, philosopher Richard Swinburne offers a very elegant two-minds solution. He argues that when the divine word became incarnate as Jesus of Nazareth, he didn't stop being God. The divine mind of the Son remains fully omniscient and fully powerful, but the divine person took on a second, fully human belief system, a human mind.
But how do they interact without the omniscience just overriding the human brain?
Swinburne argues that the divine person consciously and continuously restricts the flow of information. He prevents his infinite divine knowledge from flooding his human consciousness. So the human mind of Jesus operates under genuine human limitations. He has to learn how to walk, how to read, how to speak Aramaic.
But wait, if his human mind is limited, does that mean Jesus had false beliefs? Did he think the earth was flat? Because if he has false beliefs, he's not perfect truth.
This is where Swinburne introduces a brilliant nuance, the concept of inclinations to belief. He argues that the human mind of Jesus did not possess definitive false beliefs. Instead, he experienced the human inclinations to believe things based on the limited evidence of his culture and time. His human psychology felt the weight of limited perspective, but his divine nature guarded him from formally affirming error.
Let me try an analogy here. Think about a grandmaster chess player who decides to play a game against a complete novice. But the grandmaster wants to experience the game like a novice, so he puts a blinder over his eyes so he can only see 1/4 of the chessboard at a time. The person playing is still the grandmaster. He still possesses all his grandmaster knowledge in his mind, but he is willingly operating his strategy through a localized physical constraint to experience the genuine limitations of the game.
That is a highly apt comparison. God the Son willfully accepts the constraints of a human brain, experiencing the world through a localized perspective without ever surrendering his underlying divine identity. Now, this profound willingness of God to become physical, to enter material reality, brings us to another highly philosophized doctrine, the Eucharist or communion.
Right. Alexander Press has a chapter on the doctrine of real presence because Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and many Protestants believe that during the liturgy, the bread and wine actually become the body and blood of Christ. But logically, spatially, how on earth can a single physical human body, the resurrected body of Jesus, be spatially present on thousands of different altars in Paris, Tokyo, and New York at the exact same time?
Philosophy has to deeply untangle what it means to be present. Does Christ's body take up physical, measurable dimensions on the altar? Does it displace the air around it? Press explores how philosophers use concepts of multi-location. They argue that Christ's presence in the Eucharist is a substantial presence, not a dimensive one. His substance is fully there, but it is not constrained by the normal geometry of space. It's a metaphysical reality intersecting with physical objects.
And as Jerry L. Walls argues in the text, these seemingly abstract debates about the Eucharist are intimately connected to the highest possible stakes, the doctrines of heaven and hell.
Exactly. For ancient and medieval Christians, the Eucharist wasn't just a symbol. It was the medicine of immortality. It was the physical conduit to the divine life that prepares the soul for heaven. And Walls points out that when you bring heaven and hell into the philosophical picture, the tone of the whole discussion changes. The sheer extremity of the afterlife, the concept of eternal, unimaginable joy versus absolute, permanent horror and separation, is what makes the philosophical quest for truth so momentous. This isn't just an academic puzzle for a whiteboard. The stakes are literally your eternal destiny.
Which is exactly why the daily practical life of a believer, specifically the practice of prayer, is so vital. But even prayer presents a massive philosophical puzzle. Scotty Davison and Eleanor Stump tackle this in the Handbook.
What's fascinating here is how philosophy tackles the problem of petitionary prayer. If God is completely omniscient, he already knows exactly what you need before you ask. And if God is perfectly good, he will always choose to do what is best for the universe, regardless of whether you ask or not. Furthermore, if God is immutable, unchanging, your prayer cannot literally change his mind.
So, what is the point of praying? Are you just talking to the ceiling?
I thought Eleanor Stump's answer to this was profoundly human. She bypasses the strict metaphysics and looks at the psychology of relationships. She argues that if God just constantly gave us everything we needed perfectly automatically, without us ever having to realize our need or articulate it, we would become spiritually catastrophic human beings.
We would. We would become completely spoiled, passive, and totally dominated by him if every time you needed rent money, it just magically appeared in your account. You would treat God like a cosmic vending machine. You would become a slavish, lackey-like follower, totally dependent but completely devoid of character. It's exactly like parenting. If you have a 5-year-old child, you don't just tie their shoes for them in silence every single day until they go to college. You know they need their shoes tied. But eventually you stop and make them ask for help. Why? Because you are trying to teach them how to communicate. You are trying to move them from passive recipients into active participants.
Stump argues that petitionary prayer is God's mechanism for relational maturity. By making certain blessings contingent upon our asking, God invites us into a collaborative relationship. He forces us to stop, reflect on what we truly desire, articulate our dependence, and actively participate in the unfolding of his grace. It preserves our human agency within a relationship of absolute infinite dependence.
Okay, we have spent a lot of time mapping out the incredibly complex Christian philosophical landscape. But this handbook is massive, and we have to broaden the lens. How did the other great monotheistic traditions employ philosophy to tackle these exact same mysteries?
Daniel H. Frank provides a superb overview of Jewish philosophical theology. And to understand the Jewish approach, you have to look at the medieval giants, specifically Saadia Gaon and Moses Maimonides. In Jewish philosophical theology, there is a fundamental driving dynamic between two concepts, immunot and diot.
Explain the difference between the two because it's the engine of their entire philosophical project.
Immunot translates roughly to beliefs or opinions that you hold purely based on scriptural authority or the tradition of the community. You believe God created the world simply because the Torah says so. You haven't logically proven it, you just trust the text. Diot, on the other hand, are those exact same beliefs, but now held on the basis of rigorous, internalized philosophical conviction. You believe God created the world because you have worked through the cosmological arguments and proved it to your own intellect.
So Saadia Gaon's entire goal was to elevate the Jewish believer. He didn't want them to blindly rely on immunot. He wanted them to achieve the intellectual maturity and unshakable conviction of diot. And Frank uses this brilliant metaphor to describe how these medieval philosophers viewed their job. He calls the medieval Jewish philosopher an archaeologist.
I love that metaphor. Modern philosophers often see themselves as architects. They are trying to invent brand new systems of thought from scratch. But Saadia Gaon and Maimonides didn't think they were inventing anything new. They believed the absolute truth was already present in the Torah given at Sinai. But they believed the truth was layered. So, like archaeologists, they were digging beneath the literal surface-level meaning of the biblical text to unearth the deep, regulative, philosophical truth hidden underneath.
And the absolute pinnacle of this archaeological dig is Maimonides' masterwork, The Guide for the Perplexed. But the context of this book is vital. The sources make it clear that the guide is not just a dry academic textbook meant for a university library. It is actually a highly personal, pastoral intervention.
Exactly. It was written as a personal epistle to a beloved student of Maimonides named Joseph. And Joseph was undergoing a massive, crushing existential crisis.
A crisis that sounds incredibly modern. Joseph was torn. On one hand, he had his traditional Orthodox religious upbringing. On the other hand, he was doing advanced studies in the cutting-edge science of his day, which was Aristotelian philosophy and physics. And the science seemed to violently contradict the literal reading of the Bible. Aristotle said the universe was eternal. The Bible said it had a beginning. Joseph was paralyzed, essentially having a panic attack about losing his faith or denying his intellect.
Maimonides wrote the guide as a therapeutic text to cure his students' perplexity. He used incredibly advanced philosophy not to destroy the student's faith, but to show him how to dig beneath the literal text. By doing so, Maimonides safely repositioned Joseph back within the halakhic or legal and communal framework of Judaism, proving that true advanced philosophy and true religion are ultimately perfectly harmonized.
It's an act of intellectual salvation. Now, what about Islamic philosophical theology? Oliver Leaman's chapter introduces us to a concept called Quranic logic, which approaches its core text in a very different way than Christianity or Judaism do.
Yes, in Christianity, the central miracle is an event, the incarnation and resurrection of Jesus. The text is just a witness to the event. But in Islam, the text itself is the primary miracle. The Quran claims that its very construction, its linguistic perfection, its poetic beauty, and its philosophical depth constitute a miracle so profound that no human being or even a group of human beings could have possibly authored it. The sheer existence of the text is presented as the primary logical proof of God's existence and Muhammad's prophethood.
And building out from that text, Islamic philosophy developed a very strict, highly structured hierarchy of argumentation to deal with theological truths. It's essentially a three-tiered system: demonstration, dialectic, and rhetoric or poetry. Break these down.
Demonstration is the absolute gold standard. It is the realm of the philosopher, the elite philosophers like Avicenna or Averroes. Demonstration relies on strict Aristotelian syllogisms. It proceeds logically from universally accepted absolute definitions and deduces certain unassailable conclusions. It's pure, hard logic.
Okay, what is the second tier?
The second tier is dialectic. This is primarily used by the theologians, the Mutakallim. Dialectic doesn't start from absolute universal truths. It starts from premises that are accepted by your opponent. It's debate logic. You take what your opponent believes and you show how their own premises lead to a contradiction, thereby defending your theological position. It's highly effective for defending the faith, but philosophers considered it one step down from pure demonstration.
And the third tier is rhetoric and poetry. This is the language of the masses, the everyday believer. This uses emotional appeals, vivid physical analogies, and stories.
Right. And this structured hierarchy brings up a massive tension in Islamic philosophy.
Yeah, I have to ask this because it feels inherently problematic. Doesn't this three-tiered system inherently breed a kind of spiritual elitism? If the philosophers possess the gold standard of demonstrative truth about God, does that mean the ordinary, everyday believer in the mosque who only gets the rhetoric and the poetry is just getting a watered-down, second-rate, functionally false version of God?
That is the exact tension the great Islamic philosophers fiercely debated, but thinkers like Averroes would clarify that the rhetorical or poetic language given to the masses isn't wrong or false. It is simply truth that has been perfectly tailored to human capacity. Think about it. A vivid physical analogy in a poem stimulates the imagination and leads an ordinary person to proper moral action and deep devotion. That person hasn't spent 20 years studying Aristotle, so demonstrative logic would be useless to them. The ultimate destination, submission to God and moral living, is exactly the same for the philosopher and the peasant. The vehicle is just adapted to the terrain of the individual mind.
So the truth is singular, but the pedagogy is diverse. That is a brilliant way to structure a society's approach to the divine. And truly, that brings us to the end of this massive, mind-expanding journey. We have covered an incredible amount of ground today. We started by looking at how the mid-century bouncers of logical empiricism tried to kick theology out of the intellectual club, and how the collapse of classical foundationalism led it back in. We've taken the raw, messy data of faith, ancient scripture, historical tradition, human suffering, and we've watched modern philosophers run it through the absolute ultimate stress tests of human logic.
We have journeyed from St. Augustine digging out the profound psychological metaphors of Babylon to Robin Collins showing how the brutal engine of evolution actually allows humans to co-redeem the physical cosmos. We've mapped out the dizzying event models of the Trinity, explored how a divine mind can adopt human limitations in the Incarnation, and watched Maimonides act as an archaeologist of the soul to save his students' faith.
The overarching, comprehensive synthesis of this entire 1,000-page handbook is profound. What philosophical theology proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is that taking faith seriously does not require you to abandon your reason. On the contrary, it demands that you apply your reason with absolute, unflinching rigor. It recognizes that when human logic is stretched to its absolute breaking point, it doesn't disprove the divine. It simply outlines the shape of a mystery that is infinitely larger than ourselves.
It is the realization that the intellect is a tool for worship.
And that is the ultimate takeaway for you listening today. Religion, at its absolute intellectual peak, never asks you to turn off your brain. It demands that you use it to its limits. Because the deeper you look through Jonathan Edwards' philosophical microscope, the harder you push the logic of the universe, the more wonderfully complex, interconnected, and awe-inspiring the cosmos becomes. But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as we end this deep dive. Earlier, we debated the divine hiddenness argument, the idea that God stays ambiguous to preserve our free will. But consider this, building on everything we've unpacked today. What if the very paradoxes of the Trinity, the mind-bending mechanics of the Incarnation, and the sheer brutal mathematical complexity of quantum evolution are themselves the mechanics of that hiddenness? What if God isn't hiding in silence? What if God is hiding in the sheer, overwhelming, dazzling complexity of a truth that is just one single step beyond the absolute limits of human logic?
The dazzling obscurity of the secret silence.
Exactly. Keep pushing the boundaries of your own microscope. Until next time, keep diving deep.